we do want to make sure that what we're doing is human centric. So a lot of what we talked about, we spent so much time today talking about process and efficiency, but the truth be told, we still want it to be human. We still want to make people feel like they belong really early in this process.
Hello and welcome to the All Onboard podcast, your go-to resource for all things related to employee onboarding and beyond. I'm your host, Thomas Kunjappu, founder and CEO of Cleary, and today we are excited to have with us Jeff Schmitz, the Chief People Officer at Zebra Technologies. Jeff is a senior executive with over 25 years of experience driving success for global organizations across a range of industries. And with a strong background in executive management, product management, business development, Jeff has a track record of leading teams to new heights. He brings a wealth of knowledge in areas such as marketing, research and development, operations, and of course, HR and people. So welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Thomas.
So you have had a unique, I think, pathway into gaining a title such as Chief People Officer, which I imagine has very much influenced your background and the approach that you have towards HR. So could you just walk us through a little bit how you got to the point of becoming a Chief People Officer, which is quite unique?
Yeah, I think that this is what I would consider a non-linear career, Thomas. So I started my career actually as an engineer, as a software engineer. I have a master's in computer science, and I started my career writing code. And what I found is I was working on a very complex product. And what got me out of engineering, and this is probably the question I get the most, is how did you get from engineering onto anything else? Was a couple of things. One is I found that success was based on three things I could think of as an individual contributor that I always tell people are important. One is hard work. It's hard to get anywhere without hard work. If you can work hard, that's pretty good. The second one is being positive. No one ever got in a room and said, let's promote somebody, let's take the most negative person. That's never happened. And so being positive, finding the positives is really important. And the third one is probably the most important, is being curious. So for me, as an engineer, I was working on a product. I was interested not just in the code I was writing, not just the product. Who are we competing with? Why did we win when we won? Why did we lose? And it's that curiosity that eventually created some interest in the product management team. And then I was pulled into product management. From product management, I spent most of my career after that in running a business, a general manager. So I ran a P&L for a number of businesses, and I did that. I came to Zebra in 2016, and while I had marketing a number of times as part of my remit, it's the first time I took a more narrow functional role, and I was the chief marketing officer. And I did that for 5 or 6 years, and the CEO tapped me and said, hey, we have an opening in HR. And I had expressed to him some interest I had in this. And because I was interested in people, building teams, and culture, it became something that he must have thought was compelling because he asked me to do it. I did both those jobs for a couple of years. And when our new CEO came in last year, he said, Jeff, pick one. And I chose HR. So that's the story.
That's amazing. So engineering, product, marketing, HR. So then how does your experience in all those previous functions inform your approach to HR?
Yeah, I think this has been interesting and maybe something unique I bring to the table. But I would say that of all of them, leadership is leadership. When I was the chief marketing officer, I always said, I'm not sure I was the best marketer, but maybe I was the right person to lead marketing. And HR the same way. I'm not a domain HR person, but I understand the business. And ultimately, I think as a former general manager, what I bring to the table is it's really important that HR supports the needs of the business. And it's really important to align to what do we need to be great at in HR that's going to drive the long-term success of the business. It's the number one thing. So that's what I'd take away from the general management piece. From the marketing piece, what I would say is communication is foundational, whether those are the external people, your customers, your partners, the external analysts and community, media, or whether it's your internal customers or your employees. So then communication is foundational. Being able to give specific messages to specific audiences is as important internally as it is externally. And the last one I would say is engineering. I have found maybe more applications than I thought in HR for engineering, and I will tell you why. I think that HR tends to draw in at people who want to serve others, which is an awesome, wonderful trait for people to have. But sometimes what engineers have that people who want to serve don't have is the idea of structure and process. And structure and process is foundational. We're going to talk about this later, I hope. But I think it's foundational for success in HR because HR has gone from simply service to a critical part of the business. And not only being a critical part of the business is we need to be constantly improving what we're doing. And to do that, it's good to have a baseline foundational process and to be able to iterate and improve on it. And sometimes what I've seen in HR functions is the process piece is missing. It's embedded in engineering. It's not embedded in service, but it's becoming more important as data becomes more important, statistics become more important, and insights from that data become more important in HR.
We'll definitely get to that aspect of data operational excellence and how that is increasingly defining what it means to be a great HR team or a great organization. But going to the other extreme of what HR tends to think about is employees as the customer and the employee experience, right? Which I know is something that is important to you. So could you tell me a little bit more about that? And when I think about the employee experience, I always think about the customer experience and how a lot of that comes from like marketing and customer service organizations, but now employees are the customer. So how do you think about that in terms of driving organizational success, thinking of employees as customers?
So let me explain a little bit because we've been working on my 3 years in HR here at Zebra, which is my whole history of being in HR, these 3 years at Zebra. One of the things I felt we needed to do in HR that was important is have a vision of what we were doing. And I'm going to read that vision to you because I think we put a lot of time into it and I think it's important. And it's advancing our culture where talent thrives to create tomorrow together. And I'm going to break this down into three pieces and I'm going to get to your question about employee experience because it's really important.
Mhm.
One is, I think if there's one thing that's the most important thing that we own in HR, it's the culture. And I like a definition I got from Gartner that I think is really organic. It says, how we get things done around here. And that encompasses how we treat each other, how we treat our partners, how we treat our customers, how we treat our vendors. And it has everything about having a common set of values and driving a common experience and having a culture that we feel great about, that we feel like we belong in. And I think HR ultimately, culture is owned by everyone, but the stewards of the culture are HR. And I think it's one of the most critical elements of ownership that HR has. And it's really important. Secondly, we as a company want to be a place where talent thrives. That means, of course, we want to attract the best talent. We want to develop the best talent and we want to retain the best talent. And that's the ultimate goal of HR from a talent perspective. And lastly, when we talk about creating tomorrow together, that's a way of re-emphasizing that HR is here not to be great at HR, it's to support the business objectives. And that phrase of creating tomorrow together is related to our brand and our purpose. And that's why we do that. Now, when we created that vision, what we also said is the paramount center point for us, our North Star, is the employee experience. And that includes the manager experience who's looking for HR support and the employee experience. So we've put that right at the front.
Hey, it's Thomas here. Hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Are you curious to see how your onboarding program stacks up against the industry's best? Check out Theory's latest onboarding assessment tool. It offers in-depth analysis and customized recommendations to enhance every aspect of your employee onboarding, from pre-boarding to company culture integration and more. Whether you're just setting up your onboarding program or you're a CHRO at a Fortune 100 company, this assessment can improve your onboarding know-how. Check it out at gocleary.com/onboarding-assessment. Again, that's gocleary.com/onboarding-assessment. You can also find the link in the episode notes. Now back to the show.
So when you have that kind of North Star of the employee experience and the manager experience right at the front, how do things scuttle downstream from that? What are the tangible things that you're doing as your team or as the company based on that high level vision of what you're striving for?
I would say a couple things. So another thing we're in the middle of is something we're calling HR transformation. And different people may view this as different things. I'm going to explain what we use it as. We, like most companies, run a standard Ulrich model, right? So what does that mean for those of you who don't know what an Ulrich model is? It means you have HR business partners deployed in the business. You have centers of excellence that do things like talent acquisition and total rewards, et cetera, et cetera. And that's traditionally how we've done things. And what that's led us to is a space where it's led most people who've run an Ulrich model, which is we spend a lot of time on transactional work. And the idea of HR transformation, without getting into the nitty gritty, is how do we create room so when we're doing transactional work, whether that's hiring, firing, training, how do we do that in a way that's so efficient that we have time to really do the strategic piece, which is understanding what the business needs
Mhm.
having time to do things like workforce planning. What's the workforce we need 3 years from now? Tell me if you filled my rep today. How do we make time for the strategic? And that's important, but so is the transactional, because most of our employee experience and most of our manager experience comes through transactions. So how do we make those transactions things that work smoothly? They move well. They have a great outcome. Moreover, there's a standard process that we can constantly improve them and what metrics we put on to be great at them. So that's how I would explain employee experience and inside our transformation. You got to make room for the strategic. You got to make room for helping drive the business, but you need to be great at the transactions that come at you the most so that it's efficient and effective and people want to come to HR. By the way, if anyone's Gartner subscriber, you can go look at some of the Gartner information. They'll talk about how people feel about going to HR. And they usually don't feel very good about it because the experience isn't that great for most. And we want to change that.
That's awesome because you want to think about that moment when an employee needs something from HR for it to feel like positive. It's not like a big, okay, I guess I got to
Yeah.
go and reach out to those guys over there, which is often the case, right? And I think that there's a stereotype out there, right, for your average employee across industries in terms of what they think about what they can get from their HR team. So maybe this is a good jump off point to go deeper into a statement you made earlier about that engineering mindset for process creation, right? And repeatability and scalability that's actually important on getting all of those transactions right. Even though you want to be people first and thinking about strategic initiatives, you got to get that aspect right. How do you bring that mindset in through your org in the day-to-day transactional process? Any insights you can give us there about engineering mindset to drive productivity and efficiency?
Thomas, I'll tell you the first thing I did when I came into HR as a person I had HR people reporting to me, but never ran HR as a function before.
Mhm.
The first thing I did is I established a program management office. Because one of the things I recognized that we weren't good at is when we had complex projects, including mapping our current processes of what they are today, the from and the to. I said, we need people who are good at this. First of all, everybody in HR is already busy. That was number one. And number two is it's not an innate skill in many HR organizations. I'm sure there's some that are great at it, but many of that I thought this was not a skill set. And what it meant
Mhm.
is you just didn't have the right kind of people to do that. So first thing I did is I established a program management office with just a couple people, and we started looking at process and transformation and to drive some process. So for me, I needed help. I couldn't do it alone, and it wasn't an innate skill, at least of our organization, and I think probably of a lot of HR organizations.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. One of the things that we have worked on with our clients a lot is about journey mapping and thinking about the
Mhm.
employee experience from every interaction that they have, something you're not unfamiliar with in the marketing or product kind of world, but how does that employee interact with all these different touch points from their manager to HR to recruiting and like an onboarding process. And you can think about that completely far away from tools or automation or anything, but just about mapping out what is it and how broken it often is today, and then mapping it to tomorrow, and then doing that in a structured way. I think it's more than just the project management mindset. It's also that customer empathy or just like market discovery, voice of the customer. It's like all these kinds of skill sets and ideas that can get infused into HR to really help move it forward. So speaking of which, can we talk specifically a little bit about employee onboarding? What is the role of this HR transformation that you're working on? What is the role of employee onboarding as a part of that transformation that you're making?
This is a great podcast, Thomas, for me, because as we look at transformation, the first place we looked at for journey mapping, and we actually went through some training on journey mapping, was looking at onboarding. And why would we look at onboarding? Let me tell you, it's probably one of the most often overlooked areas when it comes to cost and value creation. Why do I say that? If I look at the most recent study, I looked at one today. I won't say where it was from, but year one attrition is pretty high in most companies, and that's benchmark, easy to find. And if you don't have a great onboarding process, you're putting at risk all the efforts that your managers, your talent acquisition team did. You're putting at the risk if those people don't onboard successfully and become productive. You want them getting productive quickly, and you want them feeling like I belong, and you want them feeling like I can be successful here and I can build my career here. So all that investment goes into hiring people, and then we onboard them. And sometimes it's clunkier than we wish it was. And I would say that we certainly found areas for improvement in ours, and we're in the midst of this, but it is the first journey map we took on because we thought it was that important.
Yeah, I think that the ROI case is pretty compelling, generally speaking, right? You just spent a lot of money and you're in negative net present value in terms of the value, depending on the role, certainly for weeks, if not months or even a year, before you actually get to net positive on the return of that investment. So what were some of the key areas that you're finding specifically that you want to improve or you wanted to improve, or are areas that you see as like a pattern that there's a room for all of us in the industry to improve on?
I think there's probably opportunities in at least 3 or 4 areas that I think are critical. And maybe the one that most people don't think about that might be the most important is I suspect, and we get exit survey data for people who do leave, and we're not too dissimilar than the aggregate industry, which is you see a lot of attrition in the first year to 3 years. And I would say that starts with the interview process. We think about onboarding as its own thing. Interviewing and getting the right people in the right roles and having that be very clear of what you're hiring for and that you have a match is critically important. So I would say
Mm.
I'm going to extend onboarding a little bit into talent acquisition, say how we interview and how we select people actually makes a big difference. Are we really finding the right talent who want to be in our culture, understand our culture, understand the job they're getting into, the challenges they're getting into, and the opportunities they're getting into? Are we doing that well? So that'd be one thing. The second thing I would say is we talked about process a bit. It's hard not to look at process. And some of the things when we looked at process, we found is not only do we have the right process, did we have the right tools to make sure that the process was repeatable? And sometimes onboarding was related to things like sending somebody an email or a checklist. It's really hard if that's part of your process. So having some tool to help you ensure the process is working and some way to check on that so that you can have a repeatable process. It's one thing to write the process down. You can write all the process down you want. Making sure that it's happening is something different. So it's a process important. Once you figure out your process, those tools become important. And ultimately the people are important. So you have to have the right people who run that. I'd say extend onboarding to think about your interviewing and finding the right people for the right job. And then it comes down to getting those processes and the right tools and ultimately having the right people running the onboarding.
Absolutely. Every single piece comes together, and it's really difficult because it's like a restaurant that's open every day, and every day the chef's got to make that meal for every new customer that walks in. So if you want those reviews to be stellar, or the customer that walks in that particular night to come back, the meal has to be prepared properly with all the handoffs for that particular person, which is hard to do over and over again.
Thomas, so you're going to force me to tell you one of my greatest analogies and learnings in HR that I've had the first 3 years. And I don't think this is unique. And I've told this story before, and I'll try to do it in a short way. One of the things that we all understand is HR is a service-oriented function, right? We're providing a service. And one of the first things I thought, maybe naively when I came in here is, and as I've thought more about it, it's a good analogy, is a restaurant. You brought this up. It's a service business that we all understand. And if you were going to start a restaurant, what's the first thing that you might do? I'll answer for you. You'd probably
Find a
decide
place,
what kind of
okay.
food. What kind of
Sure,
food are you
yeah.
going to have? Maybe you're going to have an Italian restaurant. And if that's the case, I think there's 3 pages on the menu that are important to think about, are great analogies for HR. The first panel of most menus is the chef's specials. These are the things that if you go to this restaurant, they better be great because of the reason you're going to come back. And for HR, these are the things that business needs us to do, not just today, but in the next couple years that are strategically important for the business. And we've got to be great at it. And if we're not great at it, we better get good at it real fast. The middle column, if we're going to have an Italian restaurant, maybe you can't have the world's best spaghetti and meatballs, but it better be on the menu. You better be pretty good at it. And here's where the analogy breaks down. One of the things I found with HR teams is we are so service oriented. We don't have the third panel. And the third panel is, this is the stuff we don't do. Like, we're not going to make a burrito because we're an Italian restaurant. And if we did, it'd probably be not very good and it might taste like a ravioli. So we're not going to do that. And the reason we're not going to do that is so we can be great at the chef specials and we can do the basics really well. And even if you ask me to do things that aren't germane to driving the business, I need to say, I can't do that now for you. And we're not really good at that because we're so people and service centered that we want to say yes, even if it comes at the expense of what's important on the chef specials to the company or the things we need to be better at.
It does break down, right? Because if I go into an Italian restaurant as a customer, I'm not going to be asking you to make a burrito, but different leadership teams and different executive teams may have
Right.
different expectations of the function based on previous roles and previous companies that they've been at. So it's important for you to define what you're trying to be good at. And that goes back to this comment you made earlier, which is knowing the business, right? Knowing the strategy and aligning it to that. So I think this is something that it's a real struggle for HR teams and leaders is making an imprint on the people strategy, of course, but also aligning that to what is important at the business, right? So maybe to stick with the analogy, how do you go about defining your chef specials?
Yeah.
Who else outside of HR is involved in helping you design those chef specials?
Yeah. So I would say that one thing is I try to communicate with the executive team on a regular basis, but that's actually not enough. So one of the things I recognized we need to do better is we may have HR business partners who are listening to a given executive, but we're not necessarily finding ways to aggregate up what the business needs. And again, there are variable needs for business and we need to accommodate that. But for the aggregate business, we need to have kind of a key set of things that we're focused on. So what we actually did is we established what we call an employee experience council. So we asked for executive team to volunteer one or two people to have on this employee experience council so that we can go ask them questions and we can ask them questions about prioritization of work we do or ideas we have. Maybe we're going to change our compensation statement, the way we present compensation changes to employees. What do you think about that? Because in the past, we've just made changes and then got negative feedback. So how do we get more proactive and get that in front of those teams? And how do we create a team where we can go get that? So that was, I think, a really important thing that we did in the last year is create that council and create that listening opportunity so we have a better idea of what should be those shelf specials or where they think we're falling down or getting feedback before we implement something.
I love that idea. And it's not to say that executives are out of touch per se, but the folks who are operating within the business, right, across all these different layers, they will know. They might know exactly how that policy change or that communication or that big benefits change might hit in a particular subsegment of the organization much better than you presenting it to the leadership team as something that you want to get feedback on. And having it as a mix, right? Mix of different functions, newer people, seasoned people, and having this avant-garde of folks who can really test out any new idea. And that's exciting to me, that concept of even helping them. It's like your voice of the customer board, right? From a marketing perspective, you have your customer advisory board that is helping you design your marketing or your product strategy, which will then go to the rest of the customer base, of course, but you're bringing them along on that journey before you actually develop that, dare I say it, next recipe, or are we killing the...
We might be overextending, but let's go for it. Thomas, I think you're exactly right. And sometimes we don't hear what we think we're going to hear. And you're right. We do have a diverse team and we get people from all over the world. We get people from all different functions. And sometimes we propose things and they don't get great feedback. Or sometimes we learn about a corner case that something we're going to do is going to affect a small percent of the population, maybe more negatively. And we learn about that more proactively. Those are always difficult challenges.
They are. So then can you tell me, just going back to the unique career path or unique background, any other insights you might have about if you really are positioning yourself, thinking of yourself as an outsider to the people function, what are you seeing in this function? What's your take? What is more needed in this function?
I wouldn't claim to know what would solve everyone's problems, and everyone is different. And I'm sure some people are great at all kinds of things. But if I would say anything that I've learned, at least in my experience, is incremental improvement is one of the most powerful tools you can have in any organization. And this is what I've seen over my career in every function, including HR, which is if you can get a handle on what you're doing and you can make incremental changes and they feel like really small things. What I've found in my career is when I go back and think about, you always think, oh, things are really tough now. But if you look back where you were a year ago and you could say, holy cow, we're in a completely different place. than where we were a year ago, then you're doing something right. But you're never in that position until you understand the baseline of where you are. You have a hypothesis that you test it. What would make it better? What small steps can I take? And just build those small changes on top of each other. You've got to be constantly moving the bar up. And it doesn't always have to be a step function. The step functions feel impossible, but the step functions happen like a rock star becomes an overnight success after 10 years of toiling and honing your craft. It's the same way in HR or any other function.
Hey, it's Thomas here. Now, you and I might think it's obvious that people are your biggest resource, and investing in your onboarding program to make it world-class is a bet you want to make. But how do you talk about this with your CEO or CFO so that you can get them on board with investing in an updated onboarding program? They're always looking for something that can save money and boost productivity at the same time. Well, I've got something exciting for you. Check out Cleary's Onboarding ROI Calculator. It's easy to use. Just enter some info about your current onboarding process and your company and see how much time and money you could be saving with a modern onboarding solution. Head on over to gocleary.com/onboarding-ROI to give it a try. See what you learn and let us know what you think. Again, that's gocleary.com/onboarding-ROI. You can also find a link in the episode notes. Now, back to the show.
Is it Hamburg that the Beatles were in for that decade?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Before they, yeah, incremental improvement to ultimately get to the big wins. One other aspect to that, because I feel like I hear you leaning in on that, is you mentioned the transactional, right? Because often I hear that language as something that you want to be against in HR. Our team is too transactional. We want to be more strategic, right? It's like a generic thing that you hear.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. What I think I heard you say is you need to bring life to the transactional, right? Bring energy, bring joy, bring great customer empathy outputs and outcomes for your customers in the transactional. And that's your bread and butter. You have to do that. And then also make room for a key few projects that you're going to be working on as a team on a quarterly basis that you're prioritizing. Did I get that about right? Or is there anything else you want to add on that?
This is something I've learned in other functions I've run, which is when you start combining the urgent tactical with the long-term strategic in the same function or person, what you will find is almost always people will choose to work on the urgent transaction that they can complete versus putting time in the thing that maybe takes 3 months to complete and is more strategic. And I've seen this when I was in product management, same way. If you're dealing with problems and bug fixes and prioritizing those versus big, giant changes to a product, if you combine them together, people will spend all their time on the tactical. Stage 2 in HR. So part of the HR transformation that you see a lot of companies going through, and you see a lot of people advocating for, whether you're talking McKinsey language and you talk about an OWORK Plus model, or you talk about a Gartner model, which is a operating model of the future, they're all the same, which is they separate in HR the tactical from the strategic. Both are critically important. Both need your time. But when you merge them, you end up giving up the strategic. And so separating them is really the focus there. How do you separate those two so you can have people who are focused on how do I make what happens most of the time in HR? I'm moving from one manager to the next. I'm promoting somebody. I'm giving someone a raise. I need a retention equity grant, or I need to hire somebody. How do I make that great and keep those people away from how do I do 3-year workforce planning, or what's my center of excellence for robotics? Is that in Pune, India, or is it in Silicon Valley? That's a strategic decision. You'll never get that if you're focused on these transactions. So I would say that's another commonality in learning is separating those. And I think these models that you see, these modern HR models help do that. And I think the other good thing that's happening is technology is getting better to help with these transactions. Better service desk tools, better human capital management tools that can do workflow and transactional data much better than we could do 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. On that last point, I mean, we've been investing like crazy in that world, and I've just been seeing some of the awesome things our R&D team is doing there, which is just only possible with even in the last like couple of years, and it's coming to light. Let me come up with a situation that is a summary of no particular conversation that I've had, but I'm just gonna put it out there and get your advice on this, right? So I'm that HR leader that is trying to do exactly this: separate the tactical from the strategic and ensure that I'm adding in value. And I want to invest our team in doing an employee journey map for not just onboarding, but also for the promotion path for managers for the first time, because we've identified that it's important and we really want to invest all this, time, money, etc. And the chief compliance officer or our general counsel is saying, hey, that's great, Thomas. We just need your team to just make sure the I-9s get checked 100% of the time within the first 2 days, because that's not happening. And can we just do that first? What's the advice you have for a leader who's stuck in this kind of conundrum?
By the way, I think we're all stuck in this conundrum a bit. And again, I will take my background as being a general manager in a case where, let's say we had a really good year and there was extra money to be spent in OpEx. I've never seen a CEO or me as a general manager, if I had $1 to spend, and I've said this many times, and I think everyone who's listening to this probably will feel the same way, is if I had $1 to spend and I was the CEO and I had all my executives sitting at the table, the people who are more likely to get that dollar, if it's incremental investment, are going to be people who make my new products and services, my new offerings, or the people that sell them. The most logical place to put the dollar. And there's no argument against it. The odds that HR is going to get that first dollar are not high, right? Which means you need to make room for yourself to grow. So guess what? You're going to have to do those I-9s. You're going to have to figure out how to do that more efficiently. And one of the things that we're trying to work on as we step into our transformation is we've done the benchmarking. I'd like to tell you that we could spend a lot more money in HR, but truth be told, I think we're getting enough money, what we've got, and enough resources. I think what we have to do is start our transformation by making some of those things we have to do more efficient, and then make sure that we're saving that time to do the strategic. So you have to think big about what this could be. You have to paint a vision for what the future looks like that's more efficient, but think big, start small, and start where you have the biggest efficiency gain and get that fixed, and you'll get some efficiencies. You've got to start working on some levels of efficiencies so that you can make room for the strategic.
I love that thinking. And I don't know if it's different for every company, but what that actually means, but thinking in that way, what are the top things that you can do right now to get more efficient on all your transactional work, whether that's support that you're doing in a reactive mode, or how you're handling manager support, or how you're doing onboarding, or maybe it's about the feedback or promotion process. There's a lot of different things where things could be just super manual. If you can just identify that and make a project happen, now take that space, push it towards that vision that you've already pointed. So speaking of that, before we transition into most exciting lightning round of questions, can you speak a little bit to the future? So what do you think is next in terms of evolving, from your perspective, evolving the employee experience and the onboarding experience at Zebra? What are the initiatives that you have coming up that you're excited about?
I would say that what we've set out is 5 things that are onboarding that we view as best practices that we want to focus on. One is we do want to make sure that what we're doing is human-centric. So a lot of what we were talking about, we spent so much time today talking about process and efficiency, but the truth be told, we still want it to be human. We still want to make people feel like they belong really early in this process. Being human is one. Of course, followed quickly behind having the right systems and the right processes is important. I think we need to be making constant progress, right? And so we have a buddy program. How do we make that buddy program together better? How do we make sure that we're not sending emails reminding people to do parts of the onboarding process, but it becomes part of their workflow and something we can see if it's getting delayed? How do we make sure that we're communicating well with so this is item 4. How do we make sure we're communicating clearly to the employee or the future employee throughout the process? And then how do you support not just the step that you're in the onboarding, but the next step, right? So those are a few principles that we put in place related to the onboarding journey itself, which is the first one we're transforming. We're actually doing that. We're in the middle of it right now.
That's fascinating. So that's a lot to look forward to. With that said, Jeff, are you ready to get into a bit of a lightning round now?
I am a little frightened, but ready. Let's do it.
Let's go. I'm not even sure what I'm going to ask, but let's start with this, given that you are about in the middle of the country. Beaches or mountains?
I like both, but I'm picking beaches.
Okay. I like the confidence. Is there a piece of advice that stuck with you that you've received in your career that you are willing to share?
I have a bunch, but I'm going to say, be yourself. There's a whole story behind this, but you got to be you.
Okay. Making an exception card. Okay. We've got 30 more seconds. Tell me about the story behind being you.
I'm 39 years old. I get transferred across the country. I am the youngest VP at a pretty large company, multi-billion-dollar company. I dressed for success. I said all the right things. I felt like I was doing all the right things. And I got moved to a place where I worked for a guy who was just the funnest, most fun, loving, great guy. Very serious at work. Very, you know how to do things, but we always had fun. And it was really important at that moment. I figured out, you know what? We spend more time at work. We should have some fun at work. I have a good sense of humor. And I realized then, and I thought I was sacrificing my future, that I just got to be myself. And that means we're going to tell a joke here or there. And maybe you saw some of that in just the short time we've had together here, Thomas. I'm just going to be me. And I thought I was giving up on being successful. I'm like, I can live at this level forever and I'd rather be me. And what I found is my career took off faster than I would have guessed when I actually just was myself within limits of what you can do in corporate America. I will throw that caveat on there.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad you expanded on that. So, one of the ways that you did was by picking into this function and becoming a chief people officer more recently. So, what is an unexpected thing you've learned in this role?
Being an engineer and viewing things maybe a little bit more definitively is HR is full of exceptions. And I think because people are all different and situations are all different, and I would say that exceptions are the norm in HR, where they're not as much in other places. It's more the norm, and it makes the job harder, right? But it also makes it more personal.
That's fascinating. If it wasn't an exception, it wouldn't be escalated to HR, right? For the most part.
Yeah, probably.
If you could wave a magic wand and drastically improve one thing about how all employees everywhere around the world in all industries, how they're onboarded, what's one thing that would just like magically happen for everyone?
I'm gonna give you two things. One is what we talked about before is better interviewing and better matching. I think everything gets better when you do that. And I'm gonna give you maybe another one, which is manager engagement. And I think everyone in HR knows the managers who are engaged in the interviewing and the onboarding and who take care in it, invest in it, get better outcomes. And that's not to say
Get
that
the
HR
managers
doesn't do a
involved.
better job and everything else, but those things, there's a lot of dependency. Success often depends on who you pick through the interviewing process and who the hiring manager picks and the level of engagement you have from your hiring. The other stuff's really important too, and all those great things HR does. Don't get me wrong, but those two, I'd wave a magic wand and say those would all be fixed. I wouldn't have to worry about those.
Got it. So then you said before how just continuous improvement is something to strive for. And then eventually you look back at something becoming so much better, it's step function better. Do you have any tactical advice for folks for things that they can imbue into their organization to get them to be continuously improving?
If you don't have a baseline, you're going to have great trouble making things better. And if things are happening, like often happens in HR, we have different people doing the same thing in different areas, but they're doing it differently. It gets really hard. And if you want to raise the level of service for everyone, you at least have to agree on a base set of how you're going to respond to given stimuli or work things, and then work as a group to have a hypothesis, improve one piece, put a metric on it. Did it work? Okay, let's go do the next one. Right? That's what I would say is that having that baseline is important. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that first step is hard, which is what are we doing today? Map it out. I guarantee if we take any process, whether it's HR or anywhere else, and you say, let's simply map out the process from the start to finish, you'll find some areas I'm like, are we really doing that? Is it really working that way? Isn't that an obvious place to improve? And you'll find little nuggets just by doing that. And that's where I'd start.
One last question, maybe for us to close out here. You've been involved in software and technology industries for many years, and the latest iterations of that are always just around the corner. Nowadays, we're always hearing about more automation and more AI with generative AI coming into the world. Do you think the world of work looks more human or less human if you're zooming out and looking ahead 5 to 10 years down the line?
I'll give you my answer to this, and I think about this all the time. If you look at the first industrial revolution, and we're on the fourth, by the way. If you look at the first industrial revolution, people thought, now we have these assembly lines and people are moving to the cities and soon no one will be employed anymore. And By the way, right before COVID, we had the same thinking. The robots are coming, the autonomous vehicles. If you were watching political programs, and they were saying, what are we going to do with all these people? But so despite the fear of people are going to disappear and we're going to all live like that Disney movie WALL-E, where we just drink Diet Coke and roll around and watch movies. And if we
We're
fall
boneless masses.
yeah, I doubt that's going to happen, because no matter what the technology is, and trust me, I think generative AI is going to be a step function improvement in lots of applications, including the space that we live in, both HR and our products. So I'm a big fan, and I think it's going to change. We'll always need great people, and we'll always need people, because who's building the next Gen AI? Who's making that better, right? You can have Gen AI generate a lot of code for you, but you need to augment that with people. So I always believe that there'll be a human-centric nature to everything. I mean, if there's one thing I have learned being a person who's a little in my 6th decade now, I just turned 60, life is short, and people are actually more important than most other things around. And I think relationships matter more than anything. So we can have all the Gen AI you want, but I'm sure that can help business. And I think that can make the world a better place. But your relationships always are going to be the number one thing, probably in most people's lives. And that'll be true at work as much as it is at home. And irrespective of the technology, we'll need people, and we'll need people to have great relationships if we want to live a good life. Simple as that.
That is as good a place as any I can imagine to leave it at. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that and the whole conversation today. And I'm going to say that's a wrap for today's episode of All On Board. I hope everyone out there found the conversation here as valuable as I did, for just thinking about how your organization can adapt to what's happening out there, thinking about onboarding, and also how you can get your team all on board. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Stay updated with the latest tips and trends on all things employee onboarding and employee lifecycle. This is again Thomas signing off. Thanks again, Jeff. Till next time. Bye, everybody.